Okay, welcome grade 11s to the new learning format. For now, we'll be doing two poems online, and this will be the first one as a video that you guys will be able to access, as well as the poem that will be posted with it as a PDF that you can follow along with and make notes if you are able to print it out, or if you are able to make notes digitally. Percy Shelley was born on the 4th of August 1792 and he died on the 8th of July 1822 at the young age of 29. He was one of the greatest romantic poets. He studied at Eton College as well as Oxford. He was an ardent atheist and he married Mary Shelley, who was the author of Frankenstein, and he unfortunately drowned at the young age of 29. Out of interest, Lord Byron, Mary Shelley, and Percy Shelley used to actually be very good friends together, and they used to challenge each other to write poetry and short stories and so on. And funny enough, Frankenstein was one of the short stories that Mary Shelley was challenged to write, as they were challenging each other to write horror, and they believed that she wouldn't be able to do it. Very important to understand before we start getting into this poem is that we have to understand the poet, the era that they were writing, and why they were writing their poetry. So the Romantic era of poetry was very important in the sense of that they disliked the urban environment and they wanted to embrace the natural world. So if you think of Frankenstein and what the core message of Frankenstein was, it's about a monster that's created by a man and science. So he's seemingly very unnatural and completely out of place in the natural world. He can't fit in. He's hated by human or mankind, and he's outcast from society and eventually sent to the Arctic, where he eventually kills his maker, Dr. Frankenstein. The Romantics also had a very big love for the supernatural and the mystic, and they used to also use a lot of ordinary language. They had this big philosophy of writing for the people, by the people, so that their poetry was easily accessible to everybody, so that the message was easily accessible to everybody, from any class in Britain or around the world at the time, which is obviously very important because of the different class systems that were going on at the time. They wanted education and language and literature to just be easily accessible to everybody so that everybody could learn and understand their message. So what about the title? Okay, so the title is the Greek name for the emperor of Egypt, who was Ramses II. Ozy, coming from the Greek word ozium, means to breathe, and mandias, coming from the Greek word mandate, means to have control over. So if you put them together, you then have the title Ozymandias, which literally means to breathe is to have control over something. So now whether that is the natural world, whether that's the just the people that he was ruling, whether that's just he as a being, the name given to him by the Greeks, Ozymandias, obviously shows that he had massive control over everything that he came into contact with, or anything that came into his space and came into his aura, essentially. Some historians do think that Ramses was the pharaoh from the Bible whom Moses demanded that free the Israelites. So if we look at that in the context, Ramses at the time was building massive things, and you'll see later on we talk about all the massive buildings that he was building, and he was a very cruel emperor in that Bible or that biblical story. He was very harsh. He wasn't very forgiving, but he also cared for his people, not necessarily the Israelites and the slaves, but he cared for his people, the people of Egypt, the rightful, essentially, heirs of Egypt. So let's have a little bit of a quick look at Ozymandias' CV. His occupation, Pharaoh of Egypt, born 1303 BC, and he died in 1213 BC. He was 90 years old. His reign lasted from 1279 BC to 1213 BC, which lasted 66 years. He was best known for the greatest pharaoh of ancient Egypt, which is quite a title to uphold if you think about all the rulers that came before as well as still after him. At the age of 15, Ramses was the prince of Egypt, and he had also gotten married to his two main wives, Nefertari and Iset Nefret. Nefertari would rule alongside Ramses and would become powerful in her own right. As prince, Ramses joined his father in military campaigns, and by the age of 22, he was leading battles by himself. I mean, if you think about the young man that it would take to, lead these battles, it shows what type of a leader and what type of a character that he had. When Ramses was 25 years old, his father died. Ramses II was crowned the Pharaoh of Egypt in 1279 BC. Perhaps the most famous battle during Ramses' rule was the Battle of Kadesh. This battle is the oldest recorded battle in history. In the battle, Ramses fought the Hittites near the city of Kadesh. Later, Ramses would establish one of the first major peace treaties in history with the Hittites. This helped to establish a peaceful northern border through the rest of Ramses' rule. So that obviously divided Egypt into the north and the south of Egypt. And this helped kind of keep the peace between the two areas and establish good trade routes, or historical trade routes as well. So this is why he's known as such a brilliant pharaoh. But still, we have to ask the question, why Ramses II? Why would somebody write a poem about this man? Well, Ramses II is also known as the Great Builder. He rebuilt many of the existing temples in Egypt and built many new structures of his own. Some of his most famous building achievements are described below. The Ramesseum, and this is a large temple complex that is located on the west bank of the Nile near the city of Thebes. It was the mortuary temple of Ramses II, and this temple is famous for its giant statues of Ramses. The Abu Simbel. Ramses had the temples of Abu Simbel built in the Nubian region of the southern Egypt. At the entrance to the larger temple, there are 4 huge statues of Ramses sitting down. They are each about 20 meters tall. To put that into perspective, your normal double-story building is roughly 20 meters tall. So to think of how tall these statues must have been and how many people it must have taken to build these statues. And you'll see these statues now in the photos that I'll show you, and how ridiculous the building blocks that they used are. And lastly, we have P. Ramesses. Ramses also built a new capital city of Egypt called P. Ramesses. It became a large and powerful city under Ramses' rule, but it was later abandoned. And obviously this is what happens to these things over time when nobody lives in them. Okay, as you can see here, these are some of the buildings that he has built. Over here, we have those 20-meter high statues that he had built of himself. And if you just look at the colossal size of these that have been embedded into this mountain over here, they've been dug out, carved, rebuilt, new stones put in place, these faces carved out, and obviously, they had to get so many artists and sculptors in to actually do all of this work. Here we can see what the ruins would look like in later Egypt, and here we have a close-up of these statues. Now, while we read this poem, I want you to keep this image in mind. As you can see over here we have Ramses' head, or the statue of Ramses' head, lying next to these legs of his. So obviously you could imagine this being one of the previous statues that we had seen of him standing nice, tall, proud, arrogant, and vain, but all of a sudden he's been knocked down, brought down the peg or two that he needed to be. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
Okay, so let's get into the poem. I met a traveler from an antique land. So obviously we have a first-hand account of someone, mystic and strange, coming from a very old and antique. That's what antique means, and mysterious land. It seems like it's an intro to a story, like he's about to tell us of ancient times, of ancient greatness, of an ancient civilization, of an ancient ruler that we have no idea of, which is exactly what he's doing. I mean, none of us know who Ozymandias was personally. We don't know Ramses II. We've never encountered him, in our waking lives. The only thing we know of him is the stories that we are told, the recollection of these, artifacts and the monuments that are built. But still, even though we see these historical things that are left behind, they still seem quite unimportant to an extent. So now we have what this traveler said. He said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone." So he starts his story by talking about a pair of vast, which is massive, legs that stand in the desert without a torso. That's what trunkless means. Often they talk about your trunk, which is your torso. So from your collarbones down to your waist, that's your torso. So they talk about your trunk. So obviously now, if a statue was standing tall and the statue is now all of a sudden trunkless, that means that the torso has fallen off of sorts. Okay, so the torso has fallen off, and there's no upper body to the statue anymore. So that means that obviously it's been weathered away. Okay, so here's our first instance of this destruction of the material things that man has left behind. They stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown, okay, we'll stop there for now. Okay, so visage is a face, and a face implies that it's obviously on a head. So we get the idea that the head of the statue is lying next to the legs. Okay, so like in that picture that I told you guys to keep in mind, you see that image in your head of the face of Ramses II lying next to the lying next to the legs of this statue. The word shattered also implies that it is weathered and destroyed, just like the whole statue in general. Okay, so like we said, the trunk has fallen off, which means that it's been weathered and destroyed by natural, elements, by the sand, by the wind, by rain, by just time in general. It's just taken a toll on this thing, and it's just got giant cracks running through it. So we know that it's obviously destruction. So if we remember closely to what the Romantics always wrote about, they wrote about nature, the importance of nature and the demise of man. Okay, so obviously this gives us our first kind of look at the theme of this poem, which is the fact that no human material things will remain over time. And I mean, we can see that happening now with a lot of this lockdown happening and everybody going into, staying out and not being as busy and out and about as what our normal lives are like. We see a lot of nature returning. We see, I mean, you can see it around the world, where the dolphins are returning back to the Venice canals, things like that. So nature is starting to take over again, even though it's been such a short period of time. And wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. Okay, so now we see we've got some lovely diction there that we can work with. So it says here, now we see that the more detailed description of the face in the sand. Okay, so now it's almost like we're zooming in on the face and we're analyzing it and we're having a look at what exactly it is trying to tell us. So the frown and the wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. Are these positive words? No. So what does this tell us about the face's rule over Egypt? So if we, give this face the entity of Ramses, it means that, he was a fierce leader. He ruled with authority. He ruled as a dictator. He didn't rule, well in the sense of that it was a very democratic society. It's not like he put votes towards people, or he put suggestions towards people, towards his subjects, and let them vote. It's not like he said, would you like to build a monument, that glorifies me? He said, no, you will have to build a monument that glorifies me. And that is the difference between sneer and this cold command that he's ruling with, and say a democratic command. Now we see the next line. It says, tell that its sculptor well those passions read. Okay, so obviously now he's still talking, or he's referencing the previous line. So the wrinkled lip, the sneer of cold command, all of these aspects that have been carved into the face of Ozymandias's podium that's left over, tell us that the sculptor, so the person who was sculpting the actual statue, knew these emotions and knew these passions just so well. Okay, which obviously means that he was either very close to Ozymandias, or he had suffered under his rule for so long. So these fine details show us that the sculptor knew the ruler and these emotions and the influence that he had very well. He was obviously there in the time of the ruler, hence why he sculpted the statue. And obviously it says read, so this is either copied or understood. So if we look at read and the symbolic meanings of the word read, obviously, we can read something like you guys will be doing now. You'll be reading this along with me as I speak. But if you read something, it means that you try and understand, or that you are able to copy something. So when you read something, you have to understand what it means. So that means that the sculptor understood what his emotions meant, or what his face was trying to tell everybody. And tell, so this is a very cool word in the sense of that the statue doesn't literally speak. Okay, so no statue can speak. This isn't Nights at the Museum where all of a sudden everything comes alive and then everything starts speaking. That's not how it works. But the frown and the sneer are so perfectly rendered, so copied onto the statue, that they give the impression that they are speaking and telling us how great the sculptor was, but also how terrible of a ruler Ozymandias was. Okay, moving on to the next line. Which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. So only the facial expressions and sculptor's work barely remain. Okay. This is the first example that we see of a reference to some legacy being left over by the dictator. But must keep in mind that there isn't much left over, which is obviously the problem, which yet survive. So survive implies that it's the last things that are left of him. And stamped on these lifeless things. Okay, so stamped is obviously just engraved and carved into these lifeless things, being the stone. And which is quite interesting, because the way, it's a big contrast now in the way that he describes the stone and describes the statues and these emotions that we can see, to being lifeless, even though it seems like we're actually getting this feeling of what Ozymandias was like, and it's bringing the statue and the story to life through his poetry, as well as the way that the sculptor carved these emotions and the sneer. Okay, moving on to the next lines. The hand that mocked him and the heart that fed. Okay, so now he's using all of these lovely things like the cold command, the sneer, etc., to kind of understand, like he says, that read, that understand, that to understand exactly how Ozymandias was, okay, in his rule. It says here, the hand that mocked him and the heart that fed. Okay, so the hand is substituted for the sculptor. So we see the sculptor is either mocking Ozymandias in his portrayal of the statue, and the heart also represents his passion that drove and fed the hand of the sculptor. Okay, so there's two meanings to this, obviously. So This line could also refer to Ozymandias and his reign. So he may have mocked the people with his hand of command by, giving them orders, by actually physically getting involved with them, and, not in a good way, as well as he still had this massive compassion. Or it could have actually just been a like dictatorship's understanding, where he has to say, okay, well, if I don't have my people, then I don't have what you call it, a city to rule. I don't have a dictatorship. Essentially, he doesn't have anybody to rule over. But he may have mocked the people with his hand of command, but he truly felt compassion for them, as he did fight for them in numerous wars. And that wasn't just a thing of him stating his claim and saying, well, this is my land, he will be arrogant. He fought alongside many of his people, which is obviously very important to a ruler, and also to the citizens as well. Okay, then we move on to the next lines. And on the pedestal, these words appear. So now he's talking about the inscription that's going to appear on the pedestal, which is the base of the statue, okay, where the statue is standing, or what's left of the statue is standing. It says here, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Okay. So this is quite a title that Ozymandias has given to himself, and it does have a religious connotation to it. So remembering that Percy Shelley was actually quite a big atheist, he obviously was able to say a lot more, or wasn't, not that he wasn't able, but he was more confident in the sense that he would say more religious or blasphemous things like this, so King of Kings is another title for God. So he tries to say that he is greater than God or any other ruler. So I mean, that also fits into our biblical illusion in the sense of that, he wouldn't let the Israelites go, so he wouldn't let Moses' people go. And it's this idea of holding yourself above the supernatural, above these omnipotent beings like God. And what omnipotent means, it means, if you break the word down, it's omnipotent. So it means it's a God that is able to do anything. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. So these are my favorite lines of the whole poem, and the reason why is because they sum up the attitude that Ozymandias had. So here we see an exclamation of his power again. He sees that he says that even the mightiest of people should look at his works that he has left behind and despair, for they shall never be able to rival his greatness. And what he means by despair is that they should quiver, they should worry, they should be scared, they should, acknowledge the fact that they will never be as great as Ozymandias was. They'll never measure up to the ruler that he was. So here in line 11, it says here the inscription that refers to his works, which might be a reference to the other statues, or works of art, or monuments commissioned by Ozymandias. Like we said, he was the builder, he was the architect of ancient Egypt. This line is quite ambiguous though, because Ozymandias could be telling the mighty to despair, as their works will never be as good as his, or, and this is where the kicker comes in, he could be telling them to despair because their works will never, last. They will all eventually crumble, just like his have. Ozymandias clearly doesn't intend the second meaning, but it's there whether he wants it or not. It's called our dramatic irony. So we see that Ozymandias kind of says, be careful, that if you think that you are the greatest, your works will never last. So it's this idea of this dramatic irony that everybody needs, or all the great people that think they are great, need to be careful because their works won't last. Nothing beside remains, round the decay. So now we see the traveler describes how nothing of his works remain. And obviously by his works, he's talking about Ozymandias' works. Decay shows a very negative idea of how harshly everything was eroded by the sand, the wind, and the time. When he says nothing beside, he also speaks of the fact that nothing beside his words remain. So nothing other than his words remain on that pedestal. That's all that's left of Ozymandias' titles, his prestige, his vanity, essentially. But more importantly, it also shows that there's nothing left of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. Okay, so here we have this lovely alliteration of boundless and bare. Okay, so the colossal, which is the very size of the statue, and colossal emphasizes the scope of Ozymandias' ambitions as well. Colossal means massive. I mean, they even call the Titanic colossal. So something like that is insanely huge. It's almost as if because he thinks that he's the king of kings, he also has to build a really big statue, essentially. So it's almost like he has to carry this image forward of building a colossal statue and a colossal empire. The statue is the only thing in this barren, flat desert that remains. There was probably once a temple or even a city, or the city of Ramses nearby, but it's now long gone. The sands are lone, which means that they are lonely. The sands are the only thing that's left there other than the statue. Whatever else used to be beside the statue has now been destroyed or buried. So there's nothing left of his legacy. The lone and level sands stretch far away. So to complement the decay of the statue, the traveler also then describes the desolate and barren desert that seems to go on forever. The sands stretch far away. So you get this lovely idea as if you're sitting or standing on a road and you look into the distance and all you see is a heat wave and a flat road that almost looks like it's turning into water. That is the idea that you have to keep in your mind when you're reading this last line, this idea of just the only thing around you standing there in this desert is nothingness. So let's have a look at the main symbols and imagery. So statues. Because this poem is inspired by a statue of Ramses II, we shouldn't be surprised to find so many references to the statues and to sculpting more generally. The colossal size of the statue is a symbol of Ramses' lofty self-promotion and royal ambition. But statues and sculptures aren't all bad in this poem. They are also a vehicle for the poet to explore questions about the longevity of art and its ability to capture passions or emotions in a lifeless medium like the stones or a painting or even poetry. So I mean, if we look at something like poetry, how do we capture emotions in words? How do we put emotions onto paper or emotions into paint? I mean, there's so many ways that you can do it, but that's exactly what he's trying to talk about. He says, you know, this idea of this legacy that we leave behind, the only thing that will get left behind is art. Destruction. The statue that inspired the poem was partially destroyed, and the poem frequently reminds us that the statue is in ruins. Okay, it does that all the time, talking about how desolate it is, talking about how weathered it is, and how cracked this visage lies there. And the dilapidated state of the statue symbolizes not only the erosive process of time and nature, but also the finite, the finite nature of political leaders and regimes. Okay, the form. The form is obviously similar to the structure of the poem, and this is what you're going to need, to understand some of the questions. Shelley's sonnet is a strange mixture of these two forms. It is a petrarchan in the poem that is structured as a group of 8 lines, or an octave, and a group of 6 lines, a sestet. The rhyme scheme is initially Shakespearean at the first 4 lines rhyming with AB, AB, but then the poem gets strange at lines 5 to 8 and the rhyme scheme becomes AC, DC, rather than the expected CD, CD. For lines 9 to 12, the rhyme scheme is ED, EF, rather than EF, EF. And finally, instead of concluding couplet, we get another EF group. So the entire rhyme scheme has been schematized, which as follows: AB, AB, AC, DC, ED, EF, EF. So we can see it's almost like a perversion of the two, main sonnet styles of the Petrarchan sonnet and the Elizabethan sonnet or Shakespearean sonnet, kind of mashed together into this new version of what you could essentially call a Shelleyan sonnet. Thank you for the lovely poetry lesson, and I hope you enjoyed it. You will see the questions that will follow on the PDF after your poem of Ozymandias. Please make sure that you actually complete those and that we will mark them when you eventually get back to school. Thank you.